The word hit Helen Harper like a slap across the face the moment she stepped through the door of the Dusty Creek saloon. "I was not sent for you," she said. The words came out sharp, defensive, almost desperate, a shield she threw up the instant her eyes landed on the broad-shouldered man rising from the corner table. He had already seen her. He had already started moving. And before she could retreat, before she could reassess the catastrophic error that had placed her in this particular saloon on this particular evening in Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1882, he pulled out a chair. Just like that. No fanfare. No dramatic proclamation. He simply pulled out the chair beside him and stood there with the kind of patient, unassuming certainty that infuriated her down to her boot heels. Helen's heart was hammering. She had a secret tucked inside her coat, folded into the lining with careful, trembling fingers, a letter, a contract, a name that was not his. She had ridden 12 hours on a swaying stagecoach from Santa Fe, survived a broken axle outside a town so small it did not appear on any map, and endured the leering gaze of 3 men who had clearly mistaken her traveling alone for an open invitation. She had done all of this to meet a man named Gerald Croft, a widower rancher who had posted an advertisement in the Santa Fe Gazette seeking a housekeeper with culinary experience. Not a wife, not a companion, a housekeeper, and Gerald Croft was not this man. The man standing with his hand on the chair back was looking at her with eyes the color of dark amber, the kind of eyes that seemed to collect light rather than reflect it. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness and a mouth that suggested something more complicated than stubbornness alone. His hat was in his other hand, held loose at his side with the practiced ease of a man who removed his hat for women and meant it every single time. "I know," he said. "Gerald Croft sent word 2 days ago. He will not be coming." Helen blinked. The saloon was loud around them, piano keys clashing together in something that approximated a waltz, men laughing over cards and whiskey, the barkeep slamming glasses down with rhythmic efficiency. But between Helen Harper and this stranger there was a pocket of dangerous quiet. "Why not?" she asked. "He is dead," the man said. "Fell off his horse crossing the Rio Salado. I am sorry. I am Oliver Sawyer. I own the ranch adjacent to Croft's property. He mentioned expecting a woman. I thought someone ought to be here." Helen's mouth went dry. The chair was still out. The man, Oliver Sawyer, was still standing. And Helen Harper, who had not cried once during the 12-hour stagecoach ride or the broken axle or the leering men, felt something dangerous and unwanted press behind her eyes. She sat down. She did not know why she sat down. She told herself later that it was purely practical. Her legs were exhausted. The stagecoach had been brutal, and it had nothing to do with the steadiness in Oliver Sawyer's amber eyes. She sat down, and he sat down across from her, and the saloon went on being loud around them, and the whole course of Helen Harper's life shifted by approximately 3 degrees, which she would not understand until much later. But first, she needed to understand how she had gotten here. Helen Harper had turned 26 years old the previous April, in a boarding house on the outskirts of Santa Fe where she had lived for the past 3 years. Before Santa Fe, there had been Cincinnati, Ohio, where she was born and raised in a modest household that smelled perpetually of her mother's bread and her father's pipe tobacco. Her father had worked for the railroad. Her mother had died of fever when Helen was 19. Her father had followed 2 years later, not from illness but from the quiet, internal erosion of grief, the kind that does not show on the outside until one morning a man simply does not get up. Helen had been left with very little money, a small trunk of practical clothing, and a resolute refusal to become dependent on anyone. She had followed a distant cousin west because the cousin had made it sound like an adventure. The cousin had gotten married within 6 months and moved to Arizona, and Helen had found herself alone in Santa Fe with a skill set that included cooking, cleaning, basic accounting, and a stubbornness that several employers had described, in tones ranging from admiring to frustrated, as formidable. She had worked in a hotel kitchen for 2 years. She had worked in a doctor's house for 8 months, managing his household with the precision of a military commander, until the doctor's sister arrived from Philadelphia and took over the duties with visible territorial determination. She had worked briefly as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant until he sold the business. She had in 3 years accumulated a modest savings, a reputation for being exceptionally competent, and a growing awareness that Santa Fe was contracting around her in ways she could not entirely explain. The advertisement from Gerald Croft had appeared in the Gazette on a Tuesday. Helen had read it 3 times before she cut it out. Experienced housekeeper sought for working ranch near Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory. Room, board, and fair wages provided. References required. Widower, no children. Respond to Gerald Croft, Croft Ranch, Dusty Creek. It was the fair wages and the references required that convinced her. Both phrases suggested a man who took the position seriously, who was not looking for someone to exploit but for genuine professional assistance. She had written a careful letter, included 2 references, and received a prompt and formal reply within 10 days. The terms were agreeable. The arrangement was professional. She had given notice at the hotel where she was currently working the dining room, packed her trunk, and stepped onto a stagecoach bound for Dusty Creek without permitting herself any anxiety about the unknown. She had not anticipated arriving to find Gerald Croft already in the ground. Oliver Sawyer ordered coffee for her without asking, which should have irritated her. The saloon owner's wife, a stout woman with kind eyes named Rosa, brought it over with a sympathetic look that told Helen the whole town already knew what had happened to Croft and had likely been watching the door for the woman who would arrive not knowing. "I imagine this is a considerable shock," Oliver said. "It is an inconvenience," Helen said, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup because the evening had turned cold and she had left her good coat on the stagecoach rack without thinking to retrieve it when they stopped. "I apologize. That sounds callous. It is a shock. I did not know him, but it is still a shock." "No need to apologize," Oliver said. "It is both things at once." He said it simply, without the slightly exhausting quality that some men had of performing understanding. He just stated it plainly, as if both things being true simultaneously was perfectly ordinary, which Helen supposed it was. "What happens to his ranch?" she asked, because she was practical and because the question mattered. "He had a nephew in Kansas. The property will likely be sold." Oliver turned his coffee cup between his large hands, a gesture she noticed without meaning to notice. "The more immediate question is what happens to you tonight. The next stagecoach to Santa Fe does not pass through until Thursday." It was Monday. Helen looked at him steadily. "Is there a hotel?" "There is a boarding house run by Mrs. Aldridge. It is clean and she is reasonable." He paused. "I can walk you there if you would like." "I can find it myself," Helen said. The ghost of something crossed his face, not offense, but something more considered. "I have no doubt of that," he said. "I was offering company, not guidance." The distinction was carefully made, and Helen felt it land somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum in a way she chose to ignore. She looked at him properly for the first time. He had the tan of a man who spent his days outdoors, the kind that went all the way to the wrists and stopped there in a sharp line that bespoke rolled-up sleeves and serious work. There was a small scar along his left jawline, old, faded, the kind that had come from something sharp and fast and years ago. His hands were calloused and capable. He did not fidget. "How long have you been in Dusty Creek?" she asked. 8 years, he said. "I came from Colorado originally. I built the Sawyer Ranch from about 40 acres and a leaking roof. And now, 400 acres and a roof that does not leak," he said, and there was a dry humor in it that was quiet but unmistakable. Helen almost smiled. She caught it. "What brought you from Colorado?" she asked, and then immediately felt she had gone too far into personal territory for a conversation that was, after all, taking place in a saloon between 2 strangers on the occasion of a third stranger's death. But Oliver answered without hesitation. I needed distance, he said, and I needed land. This territory gave me both. He did not elaborate and she did not press. But the phrase lodged itself in some quiet part of her mind. I needed distance, because she understood it in the way that people understand things they have felt themselves, and she had not expected to recognize something in this particular stranger on this particular evening. She finished the coffee. She thanked him. She insisted on paying for her own, which seemed to mildly amuse him, and she walked to Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house alone, which she managed perfectly well, because she had, in fact, passed the building on her way from the stagecoach stop, and committed its location to memory with the automatic efficiency of a woman who had learned to orient herself quickly in new places. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the clean, narrow bed in Mrs. Aldridge's second-floor room and stared at the ceiling and tried to construct a sensible plan. She could return to Santa Fe on Thursday and resume looking for work. She could post for other housekeeping positions in the territory. She had enough savings to sustain her for several months if she was careful, which she was always careful, so that was not a crisis. What kept her awake was not the practical problem. What kept her awake was the unsettling and deeply unwelcome recognition of the feeling that had settled in her chest during the hour she spent across from Oliver Sawyer, something warm and inconvenient, like a fire started in a room she had carefully decided to keep empty. She was not here for him. She was not sent for him. She was a professional woman with a profession, and she intended to keep it that way. She told herself this with considerable firmness and fell asleep at approximately 2 in the morning. Tuesday arrived with the aggressive brightness that the New Mexico Territory apparently issued as standard, and Helen ate breakfast in Mrs. Aldridge's small dining room and asked careful questions about Gerald Croft's ranch and its situation. Mrs. Aldridge was a forthcoming woman of 50 who clearly enjoyed providing information and required very little prompting. Croft had been 58, she learned. He had run cattle on the property for 20 years. He had been a quiet man, private, not unfriendly but not warm. His wife had died of influenza in 1877. The nephew in Kansas was a young man named Thomas Croft who had visited once, several years ago, and was not expected to want to run a ranch in New Mexico. The property was likely to be sold or parceled off. Oliver Sawyer, she learned without asking particularly for information about Oliver Sawyer, was well regarded in Dusty Creek. He had arrived 8 years ago, which would have made him about 24, and built his ranch with a combination of relentless hard work and apparent good judgment. He employed 6 ranch hands year-round and more during roundup. He was respected, trusted, and Mrs. Aldridge offered with a certain meaningful delicacy, unattached, which was not for lack of interest from certain quarters of the town's female population. "He is steady," Mrs. Aldridge said, in the tone of a woman delivering a considered verdict. "Not the kind that burns bright and goes out, the kind that just keeps going." Helen ate her eggs and said that was very interesting and steered the conversation toward the location of the nearest dry goods store. She was examining bolts of practical fabric. She had ripped her traveling skirt on the stagecoach door latch and needed to make a repair when she heard his voice. "Good morning, Miss Harper," she turned. He was standing in the doorway of the general store, not yet fully inside, still in the bright frame of the morning sun, and he had his hat in his hand again. She noticed that he always did that. He was not the kind of man who kept his hat on indoors or in the company of women. In 1882 that was not unusual, but there was something in the consistency of it, the automatic respect it implied, that she noticed. "Mr. Sawyer," she said, "good morning." He came inside. He was there for wire fencing and grain, which was not the same section of the store as her fabric, but he passed her section on his way to the counter and stopped. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Adequately," she said. "Have you given thought to your plans?" "I have," she said. "I will take the Thursday stage back to Santa Fe and continue seeking a position from there." He nodded. He looked at the fabric bolt she was holding with a slight thoughtful expression, not intrusive, just present. "Are you a housekeeper by preference or by circumstance?" he asked. It was a more probing question than she would have expected, and she regarded him for a moment with the careful attention she gave to things that surprised her. "By aptitude," she said finally. "I am good at it. I find the organization of it satisfying." "That is an honest answer," he said. "I try to be honest," she said. "Is there something specific you wanted to ask me, Mr. Sawyer?" He met her eyes. "I have a problem," he said. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, left 3 weeks ago to go live with her daughter in Arizona. The ranch house is, at present, not well managed. I have had inquiries posted in Santa Fe for a replacement, but finding someone willing to travel to Dusty Creek for a domestic position is not easily done." He paused. "The work is what it is: cooking, cleaning, household management for one man and 6 ranch hands at meal times, room and board included, fair wages." Helen looked at him. "You are asking me," she said. "I am," he said. "You do not know anything about me," she said. "Beyond the fact that I arrived on a stagecoach last night looking for Gerald Croft." "I know that Gerald Croft required references," Oliver said, "and that you clearly met whatever standard he set, because he wrote to you with an agreement. I know that you walked across an unfamiliar town alone at night with composure. I know that you insisted on paying for your own coffee in a saloon, which suggests both independence and a careful relationship with your own finances." He said it without any apparent judgment, simply as an accounting. "And I know that Rosa, the woman at the saloon, told me this morning that you tipped her generously when you left, which she mentioned because she found it unusual enough to comment on." Helen blinked. She had left 2 coins on the table. It had not seemed unusual to her. "Those are observations," she said. "They are not references." "I will ask for references," he said. "I will write to Santa Fe today if you will give me names. If the answers come back unsatisfactory, the offer is rescinded." He said it with complete straightforwardness, as if the possibility of her references being unsatisfactory was a genuine consideration he was applying evenly, not a courtesy disclaimer. "I do not operate on blind faith, but I also do not require a lengthy acquaintance to recognize competence." She should have said no. Every sensible instinct she possessed said no. She did not know this man. She had arrived 24 hours ago expecting a different employer. She had a return ticket to Santa Fe and a reasonable plan to use it. But she looked at Oliver Sawyer, standing in the general store in the morning light with his hat in his hand, and that steady, unhurried patience about him. And she thought about Mrs. Aldridge, saying the kind that just keeps going, and she thought about the 400 acres and the roof that did not leak anymore, and she thought about the warm and inconvenient thing in her chest that she had been resolutely ignoring since last night. "I will give you 2 names," she said, "and if the references are satisfactory, we can discuss terms." He nodded. There was no triumph in his expression, no visible satisfaction at having persuaded her. He simply nodded, as if a reasonable thing had been reasonably decided. "I will have an answer by Wednesday evening," he said. "In the meantime, Mrs. Aldridge's terms are fair. Consider yourself resting from the journey." He paid for his wire and grain and left, and Helen stood in the middle of the general store holding a bolt of practical blue fabric and felt the 3-degree shift in her life's trajectory increase, imperceptibly, by another degree. Oliver Sawyer rode back to the ranch with the wire and grain in the wagon, and a complicated feeling in his chest that he spent the better part of the drive attempting to identify and then categorize somewhere manageable. He was not a man who was given to impulsive decisions. He had built everything he owned on the opposite principle: patience, calculation, the long view. He had come to New Mexico territory at 24 specifically to exercise those qualities in a place where they could be applied cleanly, without the interference of a past that had spent most of his adolescence trying to prevent him from developing them at all. The past he had come to put distance between himself and was not, on the surface, remarkable. His father had been a failing rancher in Colorado who compensated for the failure with whiskey, and a particular variety of cruelty that came out of him. The way poison comes out of a wound suddenly, without much warning, and leavening everything around it. Oliver had left at 18 with the clothes he stood in, and a determination so fundamental it functioned less like a decision, and more like a biological process, something his body was simply doing, the way a plant grows toward light. He had worked other men's ranches for 6 years. He had been careful with money in the way that a person is careful with a thing they understand to be their only lifeline. At 24, he had found 40 acres in New Mexico territory that nobody else wanted because the soil was rocky and the well was dry and the roof of the existing shack had partially collapsed. He had wanted them anyway. He had fixed the well first, then the roof, then turned his attention to the soil, which proved more cooperative than its initial appearance suggested. 8 years later, 400 acres, roof solid, well good. He had not in those 8 years allowed himself to want much beyond the ranch. Not because he was incapable of wanting more. He understood himself well enough to know better, but because he had watched desire, specifically the unexamined, impulsive kind, do tremendous damage to the people who practiced it, most notably his father, and he had no interest in repeating that particular inheritance. He was not, however, made of stone. And Helen Harper, with her traveling-worn skirt and her 3 degrees of composed alertness, and her 2 coins left precisely on a table in a saloon, had walked through the door of the Dusty Creek Saloon and scrambled something in his chest that he had kept carefully unscrambled for years. He wrote to Santa Fe that afternoon. He sent the telegram via the Dusty Creek Telegraph Office, addressed to Dr. Marcus Webb and a Mrs. Harriet Flowers, whose names Helen had given him on a small piece of paper she had torn from a notebook with the same efficient precision with which she apparently did everything. He received the replies Wednesday morning, both prompt, both unambiguous in their praise. Dr. Webb's reply called her indispensable and honest, and said he was sorry to have lost her household management. Mrs. Flowers, who turned out to be a boarding-house owner in Santa Fe, said Miss Harper was the most organized woman she had ever encountered, and that any employer who was fortunate enough to hire her should understand they were getting considerably more than they were paying for. Oliver read both replies twice, and then put them in his coat pocket, and rode into Dusty Creek. Helen was on the porch of Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house when he arrived, reading a newspaper she had apparently acquired from somewhere, sitting straight in the wooden chair the way she did everything with a kind of effortful composure that he was beginning to recognize as armor rather than coldness. She had mended the traveling skirt, he noticed, with stitches so neat they were nearly invisible. She looked up when she heard the horse. "Wednesday evening," she said. "You are early." "The replies came sooner than expected," he said. He dismounted and came up to the porch and handed her the telegram copies. "Read them yourself. I would rather you know exactly what was said." She read them. Both of them carefully, the way she apparently read everything, and he watched her process the warmth of the words with a slight pursing of her mouth that he thought might be the thing she did when something moved her that she was not willing to admit was moving her. She handed them back. "Well," she said, "I am gratified if not surprised." "Are you surprised by nothing?" he asked, and it came out with more warmth than he intended. She looked at him. "By very little," she said. But something in her eyes shifted briefly, and it was not defensive. It was something more like honesty arriving uninvited, the way it sometimes does. "By some things," she amended quietly. He sat down in the other porch chair without being invited, because they had apparently reached the stage where he could sit down without it being an imposition, and she did not comment on it, which confirmed his read. They discussed terms. She was businesslike and precise. She had clearly already decided what was acceptable and what was not. Wages, she wanted clarified in writing. Her own room with a lock on the door, which was not an unusual request, and which he agreed to without hesitation. Sundays off, all of them non-negotiable. She would cook 3 meals a day for him and the hands, manage the household accounts, keep the house, and do laundry on a rotation. She would not be expected to perform ranch work of any kind. She would be addressed as Miss Harper by everyone on the property. He agreed to everything. He wrote it down on a piece of paper she produced from her notebook, and they both signed it, and she folded her copy and put it inside the notebook and looked up at him with those careful gray eyes. "When do I begin?" she asked. "Saturday," he said. "Give yourself tomorrow to recover from the journey." "I am fully recovered," she said. "Then give yourself tomorrow because you have it," he said. "Rest is not a failure of character." She looked at him for a long moment as if the sentence required examination. Then she said, "All right." Saturday. He stood up to go, hat in hand, and at the door of the porch she said, without looking up from her newspaper, "Mr. Sawyer, thank you for being at the saloon. It would have been a much worse evening without someone there." He put his hat on. "I am glad I was there," he said, and meant it in more ways than he let show. Saturday arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted, and Oliver's wagon appeared at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house at precisely 8 in the morning to collect Helen Harper and her trunk and her small leather satchel, which she carried herself without surrendering it, despite the fact that he clearly intended to help with it. The ride to Sawyer Ranch took 40 minutes over a road that was more of a suggestion than an actual road. Helen sat on the wagon seat beside him and watched the land unfold and said very little, which he was coming to understand was not unsociability on her part but observation. She was the kind of person who looked at things carefully before speaking about them. The ranch house appeared as they crested a long, gentle rise, and Helen said nothing for a full 30 seconds. The house was larger than she had expected for one man, 2 stories, built of adobe with a wooden second-floor addition, clearly built over time and with care. The yard was tidy in the way that working places are tidy, which is to say not decorative but functional, with clear sight lines and sensible arrangements. There was a large vegetable garden to the east side that was clearly not doing its best. "The garden suffered without Mrs. Calloway," Oliver said, following her gaze. "I can see that," she said, and she said it not critically but with the tone of someone already calculating what could be salvaged. She was given the room at the end of the second-floor hall. It had a good window, a real lock on the door as agreed, and enough space for her trunk. The room was clean, which told her something. He had cleaned it himself, she suspected, or had one of the hands do it, and either way someone had thought to do it. She came downstairs and found the kitchen and stood in it for 5 minutes by herself, opening cupboards and checking the larder and reading the state of the pantry, the way a physician reads a chart. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to work. Dinner that Saturday evening was a revelation, apparently. She knew because 2 of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete, 20 years old and enthusiastic, and an older hand named Gareth who had been with Oliver for 5 years, told her so with the unguarded sincerity of men who had been eating Oliver's own cooking for 3 weeks. "Mr. Sawyer cooks like a man who learned to cook in self-defense," Pete said, and then looked slightly alarmed at himself for saying it. "Does he?" Helen said. "I heard that," Oliver said from the doorway, coming in from the evening check of the horses, and Pete suddenly found his plate very interesting. Helen did not smile exactly, but her eyes did something. Oliver saw it and felt the warm thing in his chest expand by a degree. The first week established the rhythms of the household. Helen operated with a precision that was remarkable without being cold. She was not a domestic machine. She was a person doing work she was good at and taking genuine satisfaction in doing it well. The kitchen became organized in a manner that Oliver could only describe as architecturally sound. The house smelled of beeswax and cooking, and the particular clean scent of a properly maintained home. The garden, to which she devoted an hour each morning before anyone was awake, began to look less like a collection of defeated plants and more like something intentional. Oliver watched the transformation of his household with a feeling that was partly gratitude and partly something he was being careful about, something that lived in the proximity between admiration and longing, and that he was not yet ready to name. They talked in the evenings, in the way that two people who live in close proximity and share meals begin to talk. Not extensively, not intimately at first, but consistently, accumulating the small exchanges that are the actual building material of closeness. He told her about the cattle operation, the seasons, the way the ranch worked. She told him about hotel kitchens and dry goods merchants, and the particular loneliness of being capable in a world that did not always know what to do with capable women. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact of the landscape she inhabited, and he received it the same way as true, worth acknowledging, worth sitting with for a moment. She did not ask about Colorado. He noticed that she did not ask, and he noticed that the not asking was not in curiosity. She was curious. He could tell, but a scrupulous respect for the private places in other people, because she had private places of her own and understood their value. He told her about it one evening anyway, 3 weeks into October, when the nights had gotten cold and they were both sitting in the main room after supper, she with her mending and he with the ranch accounts, and the fire was going, and it felt like the kind of evening that sometimes creates its own honesty. He told her about his father. Not everything, not the worst of it, but the outline, the shape of it, the failure and the whiskey and the cruelty, the leaving at 18. The 6 years working other men's land before he had land of his own. The specific private triumph of the first night he slept in the Sawyer Ranch house, under a roof he had repaired himself, on land whose deed had his name on it. She listened the way she did everything with complete, attentive, non-performative attention. When he was done, she did not say any of the things that people usually say, the softening reassurances, the minimizations. She said, "I think what you built here is extraordinary, not because of the size of it, but because of what it cost." He looked at her across the fire-lit room. "You sound as though you understand the kind of cost I mean," he said. She looked back down at her mending. "My father died of grief," she said quietly. "It is a slow kind of dying, but it is very thorough. Watching it happen from the inside of the house is its own particular education." He didn't say anything because she hadn't wanted him to say anything. She had offered him something of equal weight to what he had offered her, a fair exchange, a quiet recognition. He understood that. He said, after a long, comfortable moment, "The accounts show a 15% reduction in household expenditure since you arrived." She looked up with surprise that contained a flicker of genuine delight. "Really? You reorganized the larder purchasing in a way that I would not have thought of," he said. "But when I look at it, it is obvious." She set down her mending with the expression of a woman who had been recognized for competence and felt it land in the right place. "I kept the hotel accounts for 2 months when the regular accountant was ill," she said. "I noticed inefficiencies then too. Dr. Webb let me reorganize his household supply system. There is usually a better way to do it than the way it is being done." "You are wasted as a housekeeper," Oliver said. She looked at him sharply. "I mean it as a compliment," he said. "Not as a diminishment of the work. The work matters. I mean only that the capacity you're applying to it could manage something considerably larger." She picked up her mending again and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Someone once told me that a woman who was good at managing a household was welcome to go right on doing it, and that aspiring to managing anything else was above her station." Oliver heard the quote in her careful, clean pronunciation, and understood it had been said to her specifically by someone specific. "Whoever said that to you was threatened by you," he said. "That is their deficit, not yours." She did not respond immediately, but when she looked up again, her eyes were different, less defended, briefly, as if a layer had shifted. "You say direct things," she said. "I find it more efficient," he said. The look that crossed her face then was something he turned over for hours afterward, lying awake in his own room down the hall, listening to the quiet of the ranch at night. It had been somewhere between vulnerability and laughter, between being caught off guard and feeling, for a moment, entirely safe. He was in very serious trouble, and he was clear-eyed enough about himself to know it. November came in with cold winds and the particular quality of light that turned the New Mexico landscape into something that looked carved rather than grown. The cattle operation was moving toward its late autumn rhythms. The ranch hands had settled into a comfortable familiarity with Helen's management of the household that involved considerable respect and a certain amount of careful behavior in her presence that Oliver found quietly entertaining. Gareth, who had seen 50 hard years and was not given to sentimentality, told Oliver one morning at the corral that Miss Harper reminded him of a schoolteacher he'd had in Missouri who could stop a boy dead at 30 yards with a look, but who gave you such a square deal that you never minded. "She is a square dealer," Oliver agreed, with a neutrality he was mostly managing. "She's also the best cook I've ever encountered in the territory," Gareth said, "and I mean that including the restaurant in Albuquerque." He looked sideways at Oliver. "You going to tell her that, or just keep looking at her when you think no one's watching?" Oliver gave him a look. Gareth went back to the fence post he was setting with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say. The complication arrived in the second week of November, in the form of a rider from Santa Fe named Clement Bauer. Clement Bauer was 40 years old, well-dressed by frontier standards, with a round, prosperous face and the manner of a man who was accustomed to getting things arranged to his satisfaction. He arrived at the Sawyer Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, which was irregular enough that Helen came to the kitchen window when she heard the horse, and Oliver, coming in from the north field, reached the yard to find the man already dismounted and looking at the house with an appraising expression. Helen came to the door. Oliver saw her face change when she saw the rider, not dramatically, but he had learned her face well enough in 6 weeks to read the small tells, and what he saw was not pleasure but a very controlled version of alarm. "Mr. Bauer," she said. Her voice was level. "Miss Harper," Clement Bauer said, with a smile that Oliver immediately, instinctively did not trust. "I heard you had gone to Dusty Creek. I thought I would come and see how you were faring." "You came a long way to inquire after my welfare," Helen said. "Well," Bauer spread his hands, a gesture of casual magnanimity. "There is also the matter of your contract." Oliver had reached them by this point. He looked at Helen. Her expression was controlled, but he could see the cost of the control. "What contract?" he said. Bauer turned to him with the smooth, practiced pivot of a man who always knew who else was in the room. "And you must be Mr. Sawyer. I've heard of your operation. Clement Bauer. I run the Bauer Trading Company out of Santa Fe." He extended his hand. Oliver shook it once briefly, because manners were manners. "I had an arrangement with Miss Harper. She was working for me as a bookkeeper for the better part of this past spring, on a contract that specified she would return to Santa Fe by the end of September." "That contract expired," Helen said. Her voice was still even, but there was something underneath it like iron. "The contract expired," Bauer agreed, pleasantly, "and was automatically renewed under its own terms, which she signed." He was still addressing Oliver, which was a tactic. He was attempting to speak over Helen's head about Helen. Oliver kept his attention evenly divided between them. "I am simply here to remind Miss Harper of her obligations, and if she is willing, to offer transportation back to Santa Fe." "I am not willing," Helen said. "Now, Helen, Miss Harper," Oliver said. Bauer blinked. "Her name to you is Miss Harper," Oliver said. It was not loud, it was not aggressive. It was simply said in the tone that a man uses when he states the terms of his property, and Oliver understood as he said it that he was claiming something, not ownership over Helen, but a declaration of what kind of house this was and what kind of man ran it. Bauer's pleasantness developed a slightly harder edge. "I see," he said. "I beg your pardon, Miss Harper." He said it with a slight weight on the title that made it less respectful than not using it. "The matter stands. I am simply exercising my right to remind you of a professional obligation." Helen said, "The automatic renewal clause in that contract was never explained to me when I signed. I was hired for a 6-month term. When I completed the 6 months, I gave proper notice and left. If the document contained a renewal clause, it was buried in language I was not specifically directed to, which I consider fraudulent. Bauer's face did not change, but his eyes did. That is a serious accusation. It is an accurate description of what occurred, Helen said. Oliver looked at her. She was standing in the doorway of his house with her hands still and her chin level and something in her gray eyes that was not anger, exactly, but the specific, cold clarity of a person who has been cheated and knows it and refuses to pretend otherwise. I believe I will need to consult a lawyer, she said. If you have documentation you believe is legally enforceable, I suggest you have your own lawyer present it to mine and we can proceed accordingly. She paused. Dusty Creek does not have a lawyer, but Santa Fe does. Several of them, in fact. I will correspond with one from here. Bauer stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Oliver. Oliver looked back with an expression of absolute unhelpfulness. I see I have made a wasted journey, Bauer said, still with that unpleasant pleasantness. It was your choice to make it, Helen said. Bauer tipped his hat, remounted, and rode away at a pace that communicated irritation very clearly to anyone watching. Oliver watched until the rider was over the rise and out of sight. Then he looked at Helen, who had watched with the same controlled expression until Bauer was gone, and then visibly let out a breath that was the first truly unguarded thing he had seen from her in 6 weeks. How much trouble is that going to be? He asked. I do not know, she said honestly. I believe the clause is not enforceable as written, but I cannot be certain without seeing the document again. I signed it quickly. It was shortly after my last position ended and I needed the work, and I was not as careful as I should have been. She said the last part with a controlled self-recrimination that he recognized as a person holding themselves to a standard. Being in need and being deceived are not the same as being careless, he said. She looked at him. He was not, I want to be clear, he was not violent or threatening. He was simply a man who believed that technical contract language superseded basic fairness, and he hired women particularly because he believed they would not push back. But you pushed back, Oliver said. Always, she said quietly. He thought about that later, too, lying awake. He thought about her at 18, newly motherless, and at 21, newly orphaned, and at 22 traveling west with a cousin who left her behind, and every employer who had underestimated her or maneuvered around her or told her that managing anything larger was above her station, and all the while she had pushed back, quietly, precisely, without complaint always. He was beginning to understand that the composure he had read as armor was armor. The question was what it was protecting. He wrote to a lawyer he knew in Santa Fe on Wednesday, explained the situation in general terms, and asked for a referral to someone reliable who could advise Miss Harper regarding her situation. He did not tell Helen he had done this. She found out on Thursday when a return telegram arrived with 2 names. She came to find him in the barn, telegram in hand, with an expression that mixed genuine gratitude with something more complicated. You wrote to Santa Fe, she said. I did, he said, continuing to work on the harness he was mending. Without telling me, she said. He looked up. I thought about telling you first and decided it was faster not to. I should have told you. I apologize for that. He said it directly, no deflection. She held the telegram. These are good names. Both of them have strong reputations. That is what I was told, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, why did you do that? He looked at her steadily. Because you are working in my house and I have a responsibility to people who work for me, and because Bauer is the kind of man who mistakes the distance between Santa Fe and Dusty Creek for protection. He paused. And because you deserve someone in your corner and I appear to be in the vicinity. The thing that happened to her face then was not the armor shifting. It was something more fundamental, like a window opening in a room that had been closed for a very long time, and the quality of light that came in was briefly, acutely visible before she collected herself. Thank you, she said. It was simple. It was meant. December came in fast. The cold deepened. The ranch fell into the interior rhythms of winter, less riding, more indoor work. The particular intimacy of people who share a space through long, dark evenings and find that the shared space becomes its own kind of geography. Oliver and Helen had fallen into an evening routine without discussing it or acknowledging it as a routine supper with the Hands, who took their plates to the bunkhouse on weekdays. And then the main room, the fire, the accounts and the mending, and talking that had evolved from carefully timed exchanges into something considerably less measured. She was funny. This had surprised him because her public face was precise and composed. But in the evenings when she was relaxed, she had a dry, precise wit that came out in observations about the ranch, the territory, and the general behavior of the human race that made him laugh out loud more often than he had laughed in years. She could describe Gareth's relationship with the difficult bay horse in terms so accurate they were essentially literary. She could make an accounting error sound like a moral failing, and then undercut the whole thing with a deadpan reversal that he never saw coming. She, in turn, seemed to find something in the evenings that she had not previously admitted she was looking for. He would catch her, sometimes, simply sitting in the fire-lit room with her mending set aside, and she would have the expression of a person who is in a place they were not expecting and are not entirely sure how to feel about that. He was in love with her. He knew it with the kind of certainty that does not arrive all at once but accumulates, the way water finds its level, gradually, without drama, and then all at once you realize it has been the case for some time. What he did not know, and was exercising considerable discipline not to press on, was whether she was in a place to receive that. He had not spent 8 years building his life into something stable and honest in order to rush a feeling past the person it was directed at. She would arrive at her own understanding of what was between them in her own time, or she would not, and if she did not, he would respect it. He told himself this with considerable conviction, while spending a disproportionate amount of time noticing exactly where she was in a room. The lawyer's response came in the second week of December. The automatic renewal clause, reviewed by a Santa Fe attorney named James Whitfield, was not enforceable as written. The clause had not been presented to Helen at signing. It was buried in the fourth addendum, and its language was ambiguous in a manner that, Whitfield wrote, any territorial court would likely find in her favor. Bauer had, apparently, attempted similar arrangements with 2 other former employees, neither of whom had pursued the matter. Whitfield's letter was cheerful with the specific cheer of a lawyer who had identified a clear case and had been waiting for someone willing to pursue it. Helen read the letter at the kitchen table on a cold Tuesday morning, and then put it down very carefully and pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at nothing for a moment. Oliver was in the doorway. He had come in for coffee and found her reading. He waited. "It is settled," she said. "He cannot enforce the contract, and apparently I am not the first person he has done this to." "Are you going to pursue the broader matter?" Oliver asked. "The other former employees?" She looked at him. "Should I?" "I cannot answer that for you," he said. "I can tell you that the answer you give will tell you something true about yourself." She considered this for a long moment. Then she said, "I will write to Whitfield and offer to provide a statement if the other women choose to pursue it. But I will not drive the effort. It is their decision to make." "That seems right," he said. She looked up at him. "I have been here 2 months," she said. "When I arrived, I had a return ticket to Santa Fe in my coat pocket." "I know," he said. "I have not used it," she said. "I know that too," he said. She looked at him for a long, still moment, the kind of moment that has its own weight that both people in it can feel without either of them having moved. Then she said quietly, "I was not sent here for you, Mr. Sawyer." "No," he agreed. "You were sent for Gerald Croft." "Gerald Croft is dead," she said. "He is," Oliver said, "and I pulled out a chair anyway." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been accumulating since the saloon on a November night, the coffee and the 2 coins and the porch and the contract and the winter evenings and the laughter and the window opening in a closed room. She stood up from the table. She was still looking at him. "Oliver," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. "Helen," he said. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and he met her halfway, which was appropriate. He thought afterward, because the meeting in the middle was what they had always done. And she put her hands flat against his chest and looked up at him with those gray eyes that were not defended at all anymore. And he put his arms around her with the careful certainty of a man who has thought about this moment long enough to do it right. He kissed her. She kissed him back with the particular intensity of someone who has been containing something for a long time and has decided, clearly and absolutely, to stop containing it. It was not a tentative kiss. It was a decided one, as direct as she was about everything, as honest, as precise. He was warm all the way through when they broke apart. "Well," she said, slightly breathless, which was a version of her he had never seen and found devastating in the best possible way. "Well," he agreed. She looked up at him with her hands still on his chest, and the composure she was known for operating in an entirely different register, not armor now, but structure, the natural frame of a woman who was herself rather than performing herself, and who was, at this moment, allowing herself to want something very clearly. "I think," she said, "that we should discuss what this means." "I think we should," he agreed. "I am in love with you," she blinked. "You say direct things," she said for the second time in 2 months. "I find it more efficient," he said for the second time, and this time she laughed, actually, fully laughed, a sound he had heard twice before and that affected him the way sunlight affects a room. "I believe I am falling in love with you too," she said. "I say falling because I am being honest about the fact that it is not yet complete, and I am not a person who overstates." She paused. "But it is considerably advanced." "I can work with considerably advanced," he said. She stepped back, not away from him but into herself, regrouping with the contained dignity that was simply her nature. "I am still your employee," she said. "That is a complication." "It is," he said. "I have been thinking about that. What conclusions have you reached?" "That I would like to court you properly," he said, "and that if the courtship proceeds as I hope, the employment arrangement becomes somewhat moot." She looked at him steadily. "You are speaking of marriage." "Eventually," he said. "If you want that. I am not presenting it as a condition. I am presenting it as a direction I would like to move in, if you are willing, at whatever pace makes sense to you." She was quiet for a long moment. He let her be quiet because she always thought things through and he always let her. "Courtship," she said finally, "properly conducted. Sundays are your day off," he said. "I am told they are non-negotiable." Something in her expression softened entirely. "They are," she said, "but I suppose I can choose how I spend them." They spent that Sunday walking along the eastern edge of the property, where the land curved upward and gave a view of the valley that Oliver had told her about in passing, and she had wanted to see for weeks. It was cold, clear, viciously beautiful in the way that winter in the high desert is beautiful, no softness, everything sharp and defined, the sky the color of clean water. He told her the name he had given the rise when he first bought the land, Hope Point, which was an embarrassing name for a grown man to admit to, he said. But it had been what he felt standing there at 24 looking at everything he had purchased with everything he had. And the names you give things in private are the true names. She told him that when she had come west at 22, she had looked out the window of the train and seen the plains spreading out, and felt something open in her chest that she had never felt in Cincinnati. Not freedom, exactly, but potential. The specific vast potential of a landscape that had not yet decided what it was going to be. "I think," she said, standing on Hope Point with the wind pulling at the loose hair at her temples, "that I have been spending the past 4 years trying to find the thing that feeling was pointing toward." He looked at her with the amber eyes that collected light. "Did you find it?" he asked. She looked out at the valley. "I believe I am standing in it," she said. The courtship was, as promised, properly conducted. Oliver called on her on Sundays with a consistency that she found entirely characteristic of him, not passionate in the showy, theatrical way that the novels she had sometimes read described, but warm and present and real. He learned what she liked. She preferred tea to coffee, which she had not told him, and which he had deduced by observation. She liked books, which she had no access to, So he wrote to a bookseller in Albuquerque and ordered 3 that he thought she might enjoy based on what she had said in passing about things she had read before. And when they arrived, he gave them to her on a Sunday in January with the slightly careful expression of a man who has taken a risk and is not quite sure how it will land. She held the books for a long moment. One of them, a collection of essays by a woman philosopher, was something she had mentioned wanting to read years ago and had never been able to find in Santa Fe. "How did you know about this one?" she said. "You mentioned it in October," he said. "I wrote it down." She looked at him. "You wrote it down?" "In the margins of the account book," he admitted. "I realize that is perhaps eccentric." She kissed him for the first time in that context. It was she who initiated, stepping forward and putting her hand on his face and kissing him with a tender deliberateness that told him everything about where she was and how she felt about being there. "You wrote it down," she said again, softly, against his cheek. "I told you," he said, smiling in a way she had never seen from him before, open and undefended. "I find it more efficient." February arrived, and with it the particular stillness of the territory in deep winter, and a letter from Cincinnati that Helen received and read in the kitchen with an expression that Oliver saw from the yard and that brought him in from the cold without him consciously deciding to come. She looked up when he came in. "My father's sister," she said. "My Aunt Myra. She has been unwell. She is asking if I would consider coming to Cincinnati." Oliver sat down. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking," she said, "about the last 4 years, and about what I have found here, and about a woman in Cincinnati who is my only remaining family and who I have not seen since my father's funeral." She folded the letter carefully. "I am also thinking about the fact that 4 years ago I left Cincinnati with a sense of direction that I did not fully understand, and that I have only recently begun to feel I am going in the right direction." "That is a lot to think about," he said. "What do you think?" she asked. He looked at her. "I think that family matters," he said. "I think that you should write to your aunt and ask what help she needs. I think that if she is genuinely ill and needs you, you should go." He paused. "And I think that if you go, I would like you to come back." She looked at him. "Is that a request?" "It is," he said. "It is also something more than that, but I will let you tell me when the right time is for that." She wrote to Myra. The reply came in 3 weeks. Myra's health had improved. She had the help of a neighbor. She was not asking Helen to come permanently but had wanted to know she was well. The letter was warm and slightly relieved in its tone, as if Myra had been afraid Helen had disappeared entirely into the vast and incomprehensible West. Helen wrote back a long letter, the longest she had written in years, and told her aunt about Dusty Creek and the Sawyer Ranch and the view from Hope Point. She did not mention Oliver by name in the first letter, but in subsequent letters she did, and Myra's replies became progressively more curious in tone, asking small, precise questions about his character and circumstances with the subtlety of a woman who has decided to conduct a gentle assessment from a distance. Spring came in March with warmth and urgency. The ranch moved back into its active rhythms. The cattle were moving, the hands were riding full days, and the house was full of the noise and energy of a working operation in full swing. Helen managed the household with the ease of someone who had spent months learning the rhythms of the place and could now operate within them like a musician playing in a familiar key. She had changed since November. Not in her essential nature. She was still precise, still direct, still capable of stopping a man mid-sentence with a look if the situation called for it, but in the quality of her presence. The armor she wore was not gone, but it had shifted from defensive posture to something more like integrity, the natural form of a person who was secure in where they stood. Oliver watched the change with a feeling that was purely warm and slightly awed. On a Sunday in late March, after they had ridden together out to the northern pasture, she had learned to ride adequately since coming to the ranch. Not well enough for ranch work, but well enough for a pleasure ride, which she said she would not have expected to enjoy, and he stopped on the way back at the high point of the trail and dismounted and helped her down and said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him with those gray eyes. "I believe I know what you're going to ask," she said. "Do you?" He said, "I do," she said, "and I want you to ask it anyway, properly." He took her hands. He looked at her in the afternoon light, 32 years old, 43 if you counted the kind of years that cost something, standing on land he had built from nothing, holding the hands of the most extraordinary person he had ever encountered. "Helen Harper," he said, "I would very much like you to marry me." She held his gaze. "Oliver Sawyer," she said, "I would very much like that too." He kissed her in the spring light, and the territory was wide and golden around them, and the horses waited with the patient tolerance of horses, and somewhere down in the valley, the sounds of the ranch going about its business drifted up on the warm wind, ordinary and real and good. They were married in June, in the small church in Dusty Creek. The minister was a young man named Reverend Parks who had arrived in the territory 2 years before with more faith than experience, and who performed the ceremony with a sincerity that made up for any technical imperfection. Rosa from the saloon came, and Mrs. Aldridge, and most of the town, which was not large but was present in its entirety. The ranch hands cleaned up to a degree that Oliver had not known they were capable of. Pete had found somewhere a slightly battered flower that he presented to Helen with such earnest ceremony that she accepted it with complete gravity and wore it in her hair, which made Pete go red all the way to the ears, and made Gareth mutter something affectionate under his breath. Helen wore a dress she had made herself from the best fabric available at the Dusty Creek General Store, which was a deep blue that Oliver told her afterward was the exact color of the sky on Hope Point. Her Aunt Myra had sent a lace collar from Cincinnati that had been her mother's, and Helen wore it around her throat, and during the ceremony Oliver saw her touch it once, briefly, with 2 fingers, a gesture so small and contained and full that it stayed with him for years. They had a wedding supper back at the ranch. Helen had prepared much of it herself the day before, with the philosophical position that she knew exactly how she wanted the food to be and that delegating it to anyone else would be inefficient. Oliver had argued that she should not cook at her own wedding. She had pointed out that she would be eating the food too, and that the efficiency argument held. He had conceded, which was also characteristic of him. The evening ended with the hands returned to the bunkhouse, and the main room quiet and warm with the last of the evening light coming through the windows, and the 2 of them sitting on the porch in the long June dusk, Helen's head against his shoulder and his arm around her, and the land they had been looking at individually for months now belonging, in a different and deeper sense, to both of them. "I was not sent for you," she said quietly into the evening. He pressed his lips to her hair. "No," he said, "but here you are." "Here I am," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I am glad Gerald Croft's stagecoach ran on schedule." "I am glad for the same," he said. She looked up at him. "And that you pulled out a chair," she said. "It seemed like the thing to do," he said. She kissed him in the evening light, and the stars were beginning to appear over the high desert, and the ranch was quiet and warm and real around them. The year that followed built itself around them with the particular beauty of ordinary days lived fully. Helen took over the household accounts completely by Oliver's request and her own evident capability. She restructured the supply purchasing across 2 seasons and reduced costs in a way that Oliver said was a genuine operating improvement, not a small courtesy. She began corresponding with a woman in Santa Fe named Clara Bright, who was attempting to establish a school in the territory, providing accounting assistance by letter that turned into a minor consulting arrangement that she refused to take money for and that Clara Bright repaid in books and fierce gratitude. In the spring of 1884, Helen missed her monthly and then missed it again, and told Oliver on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen with the same direct, clear manner she told him everything. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. He sat down, which was unusual for him. He sat down and looked at her and then stood up and crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her with a careful tenderness that made her close her eyes for a moment. "Are you afraid?" he asked against her hair, "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, "and very glad." "Both at once," she said. "As it seems to work," he said. She wrote to Myra, who replied with a letter that was the longest she had ever written, full of practical advice and contained emotion and a clear decision, announced in the final paragraph with the simplicity of a woman who had made up her mind. She would come west in the summer. Myra Harper arrived in Dusty Creek in July, at 62, on the same stagecoach line that had brought Helen 2 years before, and she descended from the stagecoach with a large trunk and a sharp eye, and spent the first 20 minutes examining Oliver Sawyer with the thoroughness of a woman who had been conducting an assessment by correspondence for a year and a half, and was now obtaining the primary source material directly. Oliver submitted to this with good grace. Myra's verdict, delivered to Helen in the kitchen while Oliver was out seeing to the horses, was, "He is steady, the steady kind." "I know," Helen said. "And he looks at you like you are the most interesting thing in any room you occupy," Myra said. "I know that too," Helen said. Myra stayed 3 months. By the end of the 3 months she had become, somewhat to everyone's surprise including her own, genuinely fond of the territory, the light, the scale of the sky, the particular quiet of the desert evenings that was nothing like Cincinnati quiet but had its own quality she found restorative. She talked, toward the end, about possibly coming back. Oliver's son was born in November of 1884, a cold, clear night with the stars out in extraordinary numbers, which Myra, who had stayed an extra month and was a practical woman not given to mysticism, said was not a sign of anything but was very pretty. They named him James Henry Sawyer, James for Oliver's grandfather, who had been kind in a family that was not always kind, Henry for Helen's father. He was a vigorous baby with opinions that he expressed without ambiguity, which Helen said was a family trait and Oliver said was clearly inherited from her specifically. And they both spent a significant amount of time simply looking at him, with the slightly stunned expression of people who have been handed something of incalculable value. Gareth, who was not a demonstrative man, held the baby once and returned him with great care and said only, "Good solid weight," which was, from Gareth, a sonnet. Pete, who was young and unguarded, said, "He is the best thing I have seen on this ranch since your wife reorganized the kitchen and we stopped running out of coffee." "That is quite a comparison," Helen said. "I hold your kitchen in very high regard," Pete said, with complete sincerity. The years moved forward with the rhythm of life on a ranch that is well-run and well-loved, seasons, and cattle and repairs and additions. A new section of fencing here, a better pump there. The garden growing increasingly productive under Helen's methodical attention, until it was supplying the household through winter with stored goods, and the neighbors occasionally when there was more than they needed. Oliver and Helen's marriage deepened the way that good things deepen, not by dramatic change, but by accumulation, the layering of ordinary moments into a structure that was, by any measurement that mattered, extraordinary. They argued occasionally, about things that deserved to be argued about: the pace of a decision, the management of a problem, the question of whether it was more efficient to reorganize a system or continue to work around its limitations. The arguments were direct and resolved and did not leave damage, which was, Helen thought, the most functional thing she had ever seen demonstrated in proximity. She learned, over years, what the distance Oliver had needed from Colorado had cost him, and she understood it not abstractly but specifically, the way she understood most things from the inside, having held her own version of it for her own reasons. They did not talk about it often, but when they did, they talked about it honestly, and the talking built the kind of shared understanding between two people that cannot be constructed any other way. He learned that her composure, which he had identified immediately as armor, was also genuine. It was both protective structure and authentic nature, and he came to understand that the armor was not something she needed to discard to be fully herself, but something she had built from her own substance, and that, with him, she wore differently. Not defensively but as herself, unqualified. James grew into a boy of solid opinion and careful observation. He had his father's amber eyes and his mother's precision with words, and an independent streak that both parents recognized from intimate familiarity and regarded with a mixture of pride and the specific parental awe of seeing your own qualities reflected back at you at 3 feet tall. When James was 2.5, Helen told Oliver over breakfast that she believed they were going to need a larger second bedroom. He looked up. She looked back. The smile that passed between them was brief and warm and entirely private. Their second child, born in 1887, was a girl, and they named her Clara after the woman in Santa Fe whose school had, by that point, succeeded. Clara Bright's correspondence school had grown into a small but genuine institution, and it had been Oliver who wrote to Helen one evening in 1886 saying he thought Helen's work with Clara deserved recognition. And Clara Bright, who replied that the recognition she had was entirely adequate and that Mrs. Sawyer's assistance had been the reason the accounts had never collapsed. Clara Sawyer arrived with her mother's gray eyes and her father's patience, and as Pete observed, entirely too much personality for someone so small. Myra Harper came back west in 1888, for good this time. She made this decision and announced it with the complete composure of a woman who had considered a thing and decided it, and moved into a small house in Dusty Creek, 2 miles from the ranch that Oliver helped her purchase, and Helen helped her arrange with the organizational precision that was apparently inherited as well as developed. The town of Dusty Creek grew during the latter half of the 1880s, a small growth, not dramatic but steady. A real lawyer arrived in 1886, which Oliver regarded as a sign of progress and Helen regarded with professional interest, corresponding with him about Clara Bright's school's legal organizational needs. A proper hotel replaced the boarding house in 1887. The stagecoach line improved. A doctor established a practice that Helen thought of privately as Dr. Webb would have found adequate. She wrote to her Santa Fe references still. Dr. Webb had retired by 1887, but she wrote to him at his daughter's house in Colorado where he had gone to be near grandchildren, and he wrote back with the cheerful verbosity of a man who had time now and enjoyed correspondence. Mrs. Flowers had sold the boarding house and moved to California. Clement Bauer, she learned through James Whitfield's occasional professional updates, had faced a formal complaint from 2 former employees in 1885 and had settled out of court in a manner that suggested his contract practices had been substantially reformed. She read that last letter at the kitchen table and felt something release that she had not entirely known she was still holding, the way you sometimes do not realize how tightly you are gripping something until you let go and feel your hand unknot. Oliver, who was reading the ranch accounts across the table, looked up. "Good news," he said. "A settled matter," she said. "Finally properly settled," he nodded. He understood about settled matters and what it meant for something to finally be fully done. On a Sunday in October of 1889, Helen and Oliver walked to Hope Point. The children were with Myra in town. Pete had agreed to look after the horses, and they had a Sunday afternoon with nothing in it but themselves and the long view they had stood looking at together for years. Helen was 33. Oliver was 39. James was 4 and Clara was 2, and the ranch was 460 acres now. And the house had a 3rd bedroom and a proper study where Helen kept the household accounts and her books and the growing correspondence with Clara Bright's school. They stood on Hope Point in the October light, the way they had stood many times over 7 years of marriage, and looked out at the valley, and there was no drama in the moment. It was simply an afternoon, the kind of afternoon that does not announce itself as significant, but that both of them would remember in detail for the rest of their lives. "What are you thinking?" Oliver asked. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through her hair, which was gathered loosely at the back of her neck the way she wore it on Sundays, and she had the expression she had when she was looking at something true. "I am thinking," she said slowly, that when I stepped off that stagecoach in November of 1882, I was absolutely certain of what I was doing and where I was going, and I was completely wrong about all of it. She paused. And that being wrong was the best thing that ever happened to me. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him with the ease of 7 years of practice. I was thinking something similar, he said. What were you thinking specifically? She asked. That a man can spend years building the right kind of life, he said, and then one evening pull out a chair for a stranger and find out what the life was being built for. She looked up at him. She was so familiar to him now, every line of her face, the way the gray of her eyes went silver in certain lights, the particular quality of her silence when she was thinking something she would say in a moment, and still, somehow, not fully known, still with the capacity to surprise him, which was, he had decided, the best possible thing. That is a very direct statement, she said. I find it more efficient, he said. She laughed fully, warmly, the laugh he had heard for the first time in December of 1882, and had spent every year since then looking for occasions to produce. He kissed her temple, and she held his hand with both of hers the way she sometimes did, the way that felt like something being said that did not need words, and they stood together on the high ground in the October light and looked out at everything they had made together. Not just the ranch, though the ranch was real and good and theirs, but the life they had been building out of honesty and patience, and the particular courage of two people who had arrived at themselves through difficulty and chose, every day, to be exactly who they were with each other. Below them, the valley went on in its ordinary way, beautiful and indifferent and wide. Between them, everything that mattered. Helen Harper had not been sent for Oliver Sawyer. But he had pulled out a chair anyway, with his hat in his hand and his amber eyes steady in the lamplight of a saloon, and she had sat down. And 7 years later she was standing on Hope Point in October with her hand in his and her life solid beneath her feet. And it seemed to her now, looking back with the clear view that time gives, that every road she had traveled from Cincinnati to Santa Fe, from Santa Fe to Dusty Creek, every lost position and difficult employer and broken stagecoach axle had been pointing here, not to a ranch specifically, not to a territory, not even to a man, though the man was the most honest and steady and extraordinary person she had ever known, but to this, being fully, unreservedly herself in a place where that was not just permitted but cherished, to a life that fit. She looked out at the valley for a long moment, and then she looked at Oliver, and he looked back at her with those light-collecting eyes, and she said softly, "I am very glad you pulled out that chair." "So am I," he said, "every single day." The wind came through warm from the south, carrying the smell of the desert and the sounds of the ranch below, and Oliver and Helen Sawyer stood on Hope Point together, and let the afternoon be exactly what it was, complete and good and theirs.